Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to Stories After Dark. I'm your host, Ben Woestenburg, and this is the Novella Zone. Pretty cool, right? Anyways, I'm going to be reading a story today from my collection. The from my collection of the African Songbook. I'm going to read Beyond the Pale. Takes place in Congo during 1960s, Congo independence, yada yada yada. It's a love story. Yeah, what can I say? Not that I know anything about those kinds of things, eh? Anyways, oh my goodness, I have another one, another visitor. McKinley, Josiah, the Temptation, and my friend Kim. Kim, whom I love. We went to school together, and that's like how long? 50 years ago. Holy smoke. Oh, well, there we go. Anyways, I'll give it a oh, look at that. Hi from New Zealand. Oh, right on. Right on. I got my wife's cousins are in Oz, and we were just talking to them last night, as a matter of fact. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so that meant it was about 12:30 here. It was cool. We like we like them. Okay, so I guess I'll start reading because I don't know how long this is gonna take. It's it's a shorter story. It's I would say it's a novelette because there's only 12,000 words. It's not, you know, not 30, so it shouldn't take me 3 hours. But it is called Beyond the Pale, and, oh, yeah, I, uh, I name my characters from, people I know. Guys that I work with, I use their names. And this person, I use his name and his wife's. But that's all I ever do. There's nothing else. It's just their names. That's it. There's nothing else even closely remote to what they're like. I don't use characteristics or anything like that because that could get you into trouble, doesn't it? So here we go. Beyond the Pale. I'm going to start right now. 1. I don't remember exactly where we were when my father died, or how long he'd actually been dead before Gerald's telegram reached us. But reach us it did. Gerald is my son from a previous marriage. We were somewhere on the Congo, Richard and I, on what people these days would call a working honeymoon. We were making our way to Stanleyville under a full head of steam on board the 100-ton Edgewater Fortune. With the hot equatorial sun beating down on us, even with the sunshade, it was as relentless and merciless as it can be sometimes. I watched the river slipping silently behind us. I can still recall the trembling vibration of the ship's engines under my feet, hear the churning wash of the propellers below, and just as easily see the colorful streaks of oil in my mind's eye, staining the water behind us. I watched as the small mail packet came out of nowhere to meet us. The man behind the wheel waving frantically before we hove to, and he threw a line out to a waiting deckhand. The captain, a heavy-set Irishman with serious mutton chop whiskers and what appeared to be a permanent Popeye squint, lashed the wheel into place, pulling back on the throttle at the same time before calling down to the man. "What's this, Rodney? You seem determined to beat the devil at his own game." The man, Rodney, stood up on the deck of the packet, carrying a small bundle of official correspondence he asked the captain to transport to Stanleyville for him. He looked dirty, his shirt sweat-stained and torn, his face unshaven, his teeth, what few he had, I should say, were black and rotten. He was wearing wire-frame glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and he was constantly pushing them back into place. The other passengers looked at him with a sense of disdain, trying to avoid him as much as possible once he scrambled up the ship's side and stood on the deck before us. "Terrible business here, Jack," he said to the captain, turning to look at Richard and I with a polite nod. All of this talk about independence, he added. These monkeys ain't ready for it, I say, he went on. If you ask me, these damn froggies are pulling out too quick. Belgians, Richard corrected him with a cough, watching the captain shuffle through the correspondence and letters as if they were an oversized deck of playing cards. The French are in Brazzaville, Richard added, coughing again. It was a heavier cough, enough so that the captain paused with his sorting through the letters to watch Richard fumble in his pocket for his inhaler. Finally, reaching out, he handed Richard a telegram. Right, the man Rodney said after a moment. All the same, it's Braville for me. I'm for getting out of here for things start really falling apart, he added, pushing his glasses up. Too many bush bunnies round here waiting to kill me for being a white man, and they'll do it too if they get half a chance. Don't you think they won't? He added with a laugh and another push on his glasses. You should be thinking about getting out too, Jack, he said to the captain. You'd best be getting out while the getting's good. Obviously, you're not a man who takes his obligations too seriously, are you? He's taken this vessel to Stanleyville, Richard said, and then began coughing again, holding on to the railing for support. Both men, the captain and Rodney, turned to look at me. I made a move to help Richard, but he waved me away as he took another deep breath of his inhaler. I stepped back, stiffening awkwardly, feeling as if I'd been slapped in public. We're to meet someone who will be taking us to Belongo Station. Belongo Station? You mean the school there? Rodney asked, looking at me closer. They're missionaries, the captain confirmed. The Paytons. Missionaries? God damn me before they do, eh, Rodney? He said with a laugh. We're not missionaries, Richard explained. We're teachers. And I think it somewhat defeats the purpose. It's by Christ. If I'd have come across any missionaries looking like her, I might have stayed in the church a little longer than when I was a lad, eh, Jack? Rodney interrupted, looking at the captain with a grin. He turned to look at me again, pushing his glasses up on his nose. It was a look I've seen often in my life, that lewd, lascivious leer attractive women too often encounter in their younger years. Begging your pardon, I didn't mean to take the Lord's name in vain, Rodney added, crossing himself. I think it was done more out of a superstitious fear than any religious conviction he may have had. He didn't strike me as the sort of man who held to many convictions, and certainly not religious ones. Nobody said anything about independence. It isn't official, Richard said with an effort, wiping the spittle from his mouth and carefully folding his handkerchief before patting his forehead. What could possibly happen at this late date? Yes. What? Rodney said with a fixed smile. He turned and looked at me, his smile falling from his face. I get genuinely befuddled whenever I see a beautiful woman, Rodney said in a soft voice, ignoring Richard. And you're definitely what I'd have to call a beautiful woman. I could feel the embarrassment creeping up my face and looked at Richard, wishing he'd say something, but of course he didn't. He wasn't the sort of man to take another man's effrontery as an insult, I was learning, no matter how obvious the insult. It was something that would need to be addressed, I told myself. You don't see too many good-looking women traveling upriver this far, he went on. Missionaries, sure, and Red Cross nurses, most certainly, but they're usually old before their time or just plain homely. Ugly, if you know what I mean. Like most of the women round these parts. But yourself, he smiled, pushing his glasses back up on his nose again. You're a sight for sore eyes, you are. He smiled, and all I could see were his dreadful blackened teeth. I backed away, looking for some sort of support from among my fellow passengers, even though I knew there'd be little support for me. I've learned this much about people over the years, that while some women might pretend to like me within the limits of their own company, they oftentimes feel threatened by my presence whenever their husbands are about. The women stood huddled close to their husbands as if they were seeking protection for themselves, not looking to give it. Yes, well, we really should be getting back up to steam if we expect to make any headway, the captain said, sensing my discomfort. Clapping Rodney on the back, he guided the horrible man away from me. I'll take care of these for you, Rodney, he added, waving the envelopes. Don't you worry your pretty little head about them. But, like I said, We're going to lose all the headway we've gained drifting back with this current if we don't get underway. Of course, Jack, I understand, Rodney said, looking at me over his shoulder. I just don't want them to make the trip up the stand. You understand my reluctance, don't you? It's Braville for me, then on to the point and home. Richard coughed heavily as he waited for Rodney to climb down to his boat. Rodney paused on the ladder for a moment, looking up at Richard fumbling in his pocket for his inhaler again. You really should do something about that cough there, mister, he said, and then smiled at me. Or maybe not, he added with a laugh, winking at me directly. He stood on the deck of his small packet as the deckhand threw down the line. I watched his boat drifting on the current, a piece of driftwood on the wide river, and ignored him as he called out for us to get out of the country before it was too late. Richard watched the boat drift out of sight, then turned towards me holding out the telegram. He looked at me with a curious tilt of his head, his eyebrows drawn into a quizzical knot. I reached up to push his hair out of his face, but he turned away from me without another word, and sitting in a deck chair, picked up his newspaper. I watched his body spasm with another heavy bout of coughing as I opened the telegram. But instead of reaching for his inhaler, he forced the cough aside as if he were punishing himself, and then sat back in his chair, trying to catch his breath. It's from Gerald, I explained, and he nodded. I read about my father's suicide, thinking how he'd finally lived up to his past threats and taken his illness into his own hands. I don't know when I dropped the telegram, but I watched it, a hapless butterfly borne away on a light breeze, as though it were the memory of a bad dream. And I thought how it looked comparable to a wounded dove as it sat on the water's surface. Richard watched me over his newspaper before approaching me and asking me if everything was all right. My father's dead, I said in a matter-of-fact tone, and he looked at me as if maybe expecting me to fall to the deck in hysterics. My father wasn't the sort of man anyone was likely to waste their tears over. Certainly not any of his children. Richard took me to our stateroom, pouring me a tall drink of water. I thought it would have been better if he'd offered me a gin, but I drank it anyways, feeling grateful for the coolness of it. He lay stiffly on the bed beside me, and I tried resting my head on his chest, watching the soft afternoon light break in through the small latticed windows. The light fell across the room like the iron bars of a cage, and I told myself somewhat wryly that bars do not a prison make, not believing it for a moment. All the while, I could feel the dull thump of the ship's engines from somewhere deep within the bowels of the vessel, along with the unsteady beat of Richard's heart through his labored breathing. As a river, the Congo is everything anyone could ever imagine it to be, and then some. I don't know if that makes any sense, but in the distance, but in the distance, where the shoreline and the sky meet, where the haze and glare melt into one and make the horizon a smear that looks like a Reynolds watercolor left out in the rain, the sky takes on a texture and almost looks like a velvet drapery hanging in the evening dusk. As we made our way east, the shore started closing in around us, and the jungle sat upon us thick and heavy like a veil of uncertainty. We found ourselves locked within a shroud of mist that hung about us for days. There's a lot of diversity and economy in the jungle. If you dare yourself to look for it, only then will you see it. You'll see birds of every color imaginable, all of them keening freely, crying like they were tenants turned away from a sham funeral, until you realize they have freedom of a different kind as they wing their wiles overhead. The monkeys are chattering in the treetops as if they're nosy neighbors talking to one another across the distance of the jungle. They scream to be heard, but can't hear for the frantic screaming. And upon occasion, we'd see some silent colossus rippling the clear waters beneath us, anonymous and soundless. Nothing more than a lazy shadow somewhere in the river's depths, as frightening and as dark as a silhouette in the night. Huge hippos lays in the equatorial sun, lounging in the mud and watching us pass with what amounts to a skeptical look of unease. as if not outright distrust. Further upstream, crocodiles take to the water as a herd of antelopes approach the shore. They looked to be sleek, prehistoric monsters torpedoing through the river, leaving a silent wake that made me want to cry in alarm. In an ongoing attempt to keep us safe, the captain had restricted the white passengers to the upper decks while keeping the more than 200 Congolese locked up in the steerage below. Europeans don't mix well with the Congolese, Richard said to me, explaining, really. Congo is, and always has been, a segregated country, and as much as it might appear to be a modern city with its universities, hospitals, and even its industries, it's only the whites who prosper. And rightfully so, he added, with a touch of mischief to his voice, so that I didn't know whether to believe him or not. And not having an answer, I reached up to brush his hair back from his forehead, forcing an unsure smile. That night, it was clear, cool and crisp, the stars, a dazzling mess in the darkness where the Milky Way emblazoned a path across the sky, almost like one could imagine a child's splatter painting done with a toothbrush. I didn't recognize any of the constellations tracking their way across the night sky, finally realizing that the equator offers a different view of the world I am familiar with. I heard a violent cry in the still of the night, a night punctuated by the steady chugging of the ship's engine. I moved closer to Richard, who smiled, wrapping his arm around me as if to reassure me. "Is there anything you want to tell me about your father?" he asked after a moment of stargazing. "My father?" I turned my head, looking up at him. "About his death, I mean. It's bound to have affected you. I know how it affected me after Annie died." I smiled, looking at his profile in the dull light of the ship's frosted dining room windows. I brushed his hair back and shook my head. "Must you?" he asked, seizing hold of my arm. I I smiled, telling myself it was something I'd do for all the days of our lives if he gave me the chance. It was a habit born of necessity, much the same as I had the habit of tucking my own hair behind my ear. It seemed natural. He would never think to do it himself. "The difference is that she was your wife, and you loved her," I said, looking out at the shadows of the night. "That's the way it's supposed to be. My father made it hard for anyone to love him, even my mother. He was a firm believer in that old adage of spare the rod and spoil the child. If I feel anything at all, I think I feel sorry for the love we— No, that's not true either." "What isn't?" he asked. "I was going to say, I feel sorry for the love he didn't let us share with him. But when I think of the sort of man he was, I have to tell myself he didn't deserve our love. I don't think he should have ever had children, even if he, if he wasn't going to love them. I suppose, us being girls, we were a disappointment to him. He never said it to us. Mother would have never put up with that from him. But it was obvious he was a man who should have had sons." "How can you say that?" "Because he was my father," I said in all seriousness. "As your father, he had to love you," Richard said with that self-assuredness of a man who has no idea what it meant to have a father such as mine. I find that to be true with a great many people. "Oh, Richard," I smiled up at him, stroking his cheek gently, tenderly, I suppose. "I wish that was true. It's obvious your father loved you and your sisters, while I couldn't wait to get away from mine. That's why I married Everett when I did. I was barely 18 when I married him, and having Gerald when I did, well, I was still a child myself, wasn't I? But Everett died at Dunkirk. Did I tell you that? I must have," I said, distracted for the moment. He smiled and nodded at me. "It doesn't seem like the sort of thing I wouldn't want you to know," I said. "But I thought my life was over. I suppose, in a way, it was. You see, my father expected me to move back home with him. Our mother died some 6 years earlier. He asked me how I expected to raise a child on my own. And he meant it, too. Perhaps a lesser person would have moved back in with him, and maybe he was thinking I would because he thought I was weak. I may have been before I met it. I may have been that before I met Everett, but—" I fell silent for a moment, listening to the steady chugging of the engines and the strange silence, enjoying the warmth of his arm around me. But, Richard prompted me. But I'd changed, I said. People change. Well, that's what they say. When you fall in love, you change. That's what it means to fall in love. That's what it's supposed to happen. But the girl I was when I was with Everett and the woman I became as a result, they're not the woman you met. And why would they? I mean, well, there's been 20 years between, hasn't there? One would hope I've changed. I've raised a son without being saddled with a husband. Is that what you think being married is? Oh, darling. No, I laughed lightly. I never meant anything of the sort. If it wasn't for Gerald introducing us in the first place, I'd still be teaching in England instead of being here with you. I'd have never thought to leave hearth and home and come out here. I mean, honestly, Congo? Deepest, darkest Africa? I can see why Conrad called it the heart of darkness, but could you picture me here alone? Well, neither could my father. He told me it would be the end of me if I did, of us, actually, if we came out here to teach. Why would he say that? He didn't even know me. I only met him twice, because that's the sort of man he is, or was, I should say. He couldn't understand how I'd be willing to give up 2 years of my life to teach in Africa. It made no sense to him. You say Europeans don't mix with Congolese? Well, my father would have fit right in with that. Stanleyville, from what I could see, appeared to be a city of green, open parks, wide streets, and magnificent government buildings fronting the river and reminding me of a European holdover from the previous century. A lot of it reminded me of London's waterfront before the war, before the Blitz. I stood beside Richard on the ship's deck, overcome with emotion. The realization of having finally arrived was overwhelming to me. I felt Richard's arm around my shoulder and let myself melt against him in the morning heat. The memory of our love-making last night still fresh in my mind. He'd proven himself somewhat tentative in his ministrations towards my needs, which was something I was willing to overlook. I'd assumed it to be his state of mind concerning my father's death, his thinking how could I want carnal relations under such circumstances? But emotional anxiety often leads to intimacy, or so I've learned over the years, which, like I said, may not have been the sentiment Richard was seeking. Instead of holding me in his arms after methodically working himself into me, instead of falling asleep nestled in his arms after him spilling his seed into me, he rolled away and fell asleep. He left me staring at the darkened walls, listening to the chugging pistons of the engine and feeling the gentle vibration of the ship. I told myself things will be better in the morning. The skies quickly filled with the discordant chatter of 1,000 birds, the deckhands running about as the Edgewater Fortune hove to in mid-river, and a line was thrown to a waiting tug. I pulled myself away from Richard, leaning over the port side railing and looking back towards the stern. I could see the dark waters churning wildly behind the tug, the river frothing like foam, and found myself looking down at the excited faces of children pointing and laughing. I looked back at the city again, studying it anew. The buildings appeared to be a blend of both old and new, and while I may have been expecting to find a primitive city, I was impressed to find such modernity. I thought I'd find dirt and squalor, grass huts and naked natives, but instead I found riches. Richard explained that even though the state provided many of the services one might expect to find in any other modern city, modern society, many of the missions, local industries, and agricultural co-ops provided most of the up-to-date medical services. And what about the schools? I asked. It seemed a reasonable question under the circumstances. We were coming here as teachers. I leaned out over the port rail again, smiling down at the Congolese children who were too excited at the process of docking to think about looking up at me. Primary education is well funded, Richard said cautiously, and something in the tone of his voice made me look at him. Well funded? You mean by the state? It's state funded, I said, turning away from the children below and leaning against the railing. I couldn't help but notice the cryptic change in his tone. I watched him struggling with his unease. His smile was forced and weak. Well, he began softly, and there was something in his tone again that told me I might not like what I was about to hear. The schools here are segregated, of course. Of course, I replied, my voice cool and unemotional. Yet, yes, and most of the primary age children attend state supported Catholic mission schools. Catholic schools. Yes, I believe you told me that too, I said. And he had, I remembered. He nodded slowly. By design, the education they receive is more along the lines of vocational training and agricultural discourse rather than academic. By design, I said, latching onto the word and mulling it over in my mind. I was looking over Richard's shoulder at the children on the docks throwing lines to fishing boats and helping with the day's catch. Oh my God, I said when I realized what he was trying not to say. They want to keep them as their own labor force. All of them. Like it was at the turn of the century. The government doesn't want to risk creating an elite class of the population that might demand its independence. And so they withhold their education? He held up a hand. Admittedly, there are too few students who have gone on to secondary school, and fewer still that have gone on to university. For some years now, the Europeans have wanted to create a non confrontational citizenry that will do as they say and be dependent on them to help run things in the future. Dependent on them? And what of their independence? I don't put any stock in all of this talk of independence. The Europeans want to keep their cities, like this one, and Leo, he added, almost sounding apologetic. But at the same time, they want to carry on with their strict policy of racial separation. That's why Belongo Station is so important. Parents send their children there. It's not state run, and it's not an orphanage. Somehow, as I looked out over the city, it didn't appear as beautiful as I had first thought it to be. The modern city that stood in front of me just moments before had given way to a primitive evil lurking below the surface. The squalor I was expecting to see, I now realized, was a squalor of the heart, a blackening of the soul. I couldn't wait to leave, and we hadn't even docked yet. 2. We stayed at Leo 3, a grand hotel from a bygone age, complete with tall white columns facing the Avenue Rien Elizabeth and an immaculate garden. There was a balcony above with a white balustrade. I suppose it was Leo's way of offering guests what they thought was a romantic view of the river. But that soon loses whatever romantic ideal you may have imagined because there are industrial warehouses lining the waterfront and the constant shunting of trains in the distance. As we stood waiting for a table, I thought of how the shunting trains sounded like the pounding of drums from every B-grade adventure story I'd ever seen, from the American West of Red River and Gunsmoke to the deepest, darkest Africa of Tarzan and Jungle Jim. Had my illusory fantasies already been shattered? The bellhops standing nearby appeared ready in their fresh-pressed white linen uniforms. I could see the Edgewater fortune from where we sat. We were on a small terrace overlooking the dirty river and sharing a pot of tea. I was preoccupied, watching the fishing ships and the smaller boats tied up alongside one another as they started unloading their catches. Richard stared out over the river and then quietly excused himself, saying he had to go inside to use the telephone. He stood up, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and then bowed his head almost like an apology. Must you? I asked, reaching for him. I have to find out about our transportation tomorrow. Can't put that off until later, he laughed. No, I smiled. I watched the gulls floating like tiny white sculptures pasted up against a clear blue sky, screaming at the Congolese fishermen, haggling and arguing with one another. I wanted so much for it to remind me of something straight out of Conrad or Kipling, 100 years removed. But there was little I could do to shake off the feeling that this was all a facade. As Richard came back outside, he was forced to stop partway across the terrace because of another coughing seizure. His face turned red with the efforts it took to catch his breath as he desperately searched his pockets for his inhaler. I ran to his side and helped him to our small table, giving him a glass of water as he sat in the chair trying to catch his breath. He smiled up at me as he sat down, taking tiny gulps of air. I just need to catch my breath, he said. Shouldn't we take you in to see a doctor? I'll be fine, he said, reaching out and patting my hand as I sat down across from him, concerned. I have my medicine. It was like this the last time I was here, with Annie. That was just before she died. It's the humidity. It does something to me. Well, that and maybe a touch of asthma. I just need to get climatized and everything will be fine. I'll be fine. A touch of asthma, I said with a slight tilt of my head. Is there even such a thing? Isn't that like saying she's a little bit pregnant? Ness, he said in a reproachful tone, my attempt at humor obviously not to his liking. He went on again after a moment. That's what the doctor in England said it was, mild asthma, which is something of a relief considering I was thinking it was malaria. And why didn't you think to let me know? I asked, pulling my hand away from his. How long have you been using that thing? I asked, pointing at the inhaler in his hand. I've always had one. It's just that sometimes I have no need of it, he added with a slight smile. Why didn't you tell me? Did the doctor say coming here would make a difference? He should have told me, I kept thinking. Why would he hide something like that? If he's going to hide something like that from me, what else is he willing to hide? I'll be fine, he said in a mollifying tone, smiling at me, and a part of me wondered if he thought his reassurance was enough to calm me. What time do we leave in the morning? I asked, changing the subject. At first light. Livingston will be waiting for us with a lorry in the morning. Livingston? And is he driving all night through the jungle just to get here? Richard smiled. He's been waiting for several days now. Livingston. Does he have another name? Richard nodded. Wells. Livingston Wells. Livingston Wells was tall and slender and muscularly slim. Is there even such a word? Which was what I could see of him as he struggled with the buttons of his shirt. He was the darkest black man I had ever seen. Not that I'd seen a lot I could compare him to, and believe me, at first sight of him, no man could compare to him, because his skin was so dark it looked almost blue-black in the soft morning light, and his features were beautiful. His eyes were a light hazel color, far lighter than one would expect to see in such dark-skinned man, and I found myself immediately drawn to them. His lips were thick and full, his teeth white and perfect, and he had a smile that spread across his face like a Cheshire cat. Quite disarming, to be honest, with cheekbones that were both high and prominent. His hair hung on his shoulders in long ringlets, with a bandana wrapped around his head. His pants were too long, and to be fair, he was wearing a white shirt that was partially unbuttoned, and I wondered if he'd been trying to dress himself while he was driving. I could see him trying to button his shirt up before he opened the lorry door. He had probably not expected to see us waiting outside with all our suitcases and boxes, and smiled as he held his hand up in greeting, laughing at his own confusion with the buttons before he finally gave up. His chest was muscled, his arms as well. He stepped out of the lorry and shook my hand as Richard introduced us. Vanessa, I said, making sure to grip his hand firmly. So glad you could make it, he said in perfect English, but there was a trace of an accent I didn't recognize. The school is in dire need of your services, I must say. Oh, and why's that? I asked. 2 teachers have died, he said, as he began loading things onto the back of the lorry. The Reverend has been debating about sending the children home early, it being so close to the summer season. Died, I said, shocked at the news. I turned to look at Richard, who tried to reassure me. I'm sure it's not as bad as it sounds, he said. Well, that's not true, is it? Of course, it's as bad as it sounds. They died, but I'm sure Livingston didn't mean it to sound that way. No, madam, no. They died from natural causes, mostly. Mostly, I asked. One of them had a heart attack. Only one? And the other? It was an accident, Livingston shrugged. An accident would be the way to describe it. An accident. What sort of accident? I said, sounding somewhat dubious, I'm afraid. He fell into the river and got eaten up. Did he fall into the river and get eaten up by a crocodile, or maybe a wild animal crept into his room and ate him? What happened? He was washing up and dropped a panga. It stabbed him through the foot. The wound became infected, and he died. An infection? Wait, it stabbed him through the foot? How big was this thing? Bigger than a knife. Weed and Richard began coughing again, holding onto the bed of the lorry as he tried catching his breath, fumbling through his pockets for his inhaler. Livingston paused, looking at me as he set about tying our things down. I could not help but see the shock on his face as I tried helping Richard into the lorry. Richard shook his head frantically, motioning for me to get in first. He climbed in after me, hanging his head out of the open window and taking in short gulps of his inhaler until he finally caught his breath. "Are you going to be all right?" Livingston asked, having climbed into the cab, leaning forward and looking at Richard. Richard nodded, waving him away. Livingston turned the key and shifted gears. His hand rubbed against the outside of my thigh, and he looked at me before looking down at my leg. I tried moving, but there was little room. Livingston laughed, honking the horn playfully before setting out, merging into the morning traffic. "It's a long drive," he said. "How long?" I asked. "About 6 hours. This thing doesn't go as fast as I'd like it to. Hopefully we won't be chased by anything big," he added with a smile. "Richard," I asked. "I'll be fine," he said, his head hanging out of the window as he refused to look at either one of us. We drove out of the city along the Avenue Reine-Elizabeth until we came to the square Napoleon's Leopold II. There, I saw a statue standing in the center of a nearby park. There were white cobblestone footpaths and beautifully arranged flower gardens that meandered through intricately manicured lawns. The early morning dewdrops sparkled as if they were tiny jewels scattered across the green lawns, reflecting the spiderwebs catching the early morning light. The traffic was sparse. Most of the vehicles were old, worn-out lorries like the one we were in, or else foreign cars, Dodges, Fords, or Studebakers, that crisscrossed the wide avenue without pausing or hesitating. The rules of the road did not seem to apply here. We passed several squat buildings as well as old, pillared edifices with worn-out names impossible to read. I took Richard's hand in mine. It was unusually cold, and asked him if he was feeling any better. He nodded, but I could tell he was lying. I kissed his hand softly, placing it on my lap. His breathing sounded labored, but at least it was under control. I patted his hand gently as we turned up the Avenue Jules Rankin, then onto the Avenue Massart, before leaving the city behind us. It felt as though we were putting more than just the city behind us. I remember thinking that I was starting more than just a new life with Richard, but embarking on a new adventure. The road out of the city was wide and paved, but soon narrowed into a thin dirt track with tall jungle grasses growing along sides of the narrow path. The jungle itself appeared as a dark, haunted woodland locked somewhere within my dreams. Thick boughs and knotted trunks stood thick with twisting vines as an early morning mist crept along the ground as though it were a torn veil catching on the branches and trees. Monkeys chattered and screamed, birds squawked, and I imagined all sorts of crawling things and hidden dangers lurking in the shadows. Giant spiders and scorpions, venomous snakes, every fear, both known and unknown, all magnified by the immensity and impenetrability of the darkness that lay beyond. At last, the jungle gave way, revealing a broad savanna where we saw wild beasts that had only lived in my imagination before that. Great gray elephants, colorful okapi, droll water buffaloes. Even though we were no longer near the river, Richard assured me that all the waters flowed into the Congo, and I watched various streams appearing and disappearing through the tall grass. It served as a shimmering reminder of where we were. When we reached the open savanna again, I saw antelopes and even a rhinoceros standing in the shadows of the great jungle, watching us suspiciously. Some time later, Livingston stopped and handed me a pair of binoculars so I might watch a pride of lions lazing in the sun, a pack of hyenas laughing and circling in front of them, looking at some unseen meal. I saw leopards lazing in tall trees and cheetahs giving chase. As well, there were baboons and chimpanzees. I felt like I was a child in the zoo again, asking first Richard and then Livingston what every living creature was as that we passed. 3. Richard died 3 months after we arrived at Balongo Station just before Christmas. There's no other way of saying it, is there? Not when it comes to death. One moment he was here, the next moment he was gone. It happened just as quick as that. Perhaps the biggest irony was that his death had nothing to do with his asthma, although in the end I suspect his asthma may have done something to restrict his breathing. He was in the classroom when he reached into a closet and was bitten 3 times in quick succession by a black mamba that slithered away as the children screamed. I don't know if you're familiar with this particular breed of snake, but there was little that we could do. By the time Livingston arrived, I was beyond hysterical. I was crying and howling even as I wiped the sweat from Richard's face, kissing the tears forming at the corners of his eyes. There were hot tears coursing down my cheeks as well as I rocked him back and forth on my lap. His final breaths came in huge grating gasps, but he seemed to be looking beyond me, as if he could see something or perhaps someone standing behind me, beckoning him. "Tell Annie I've always loved her," he managed to say, clutching my arm tightly and looking at me as if he didn't know who I was. The children watched in horror as Reverend Hoogeveen tried to corral them outside as Richard slipped away from me. His body went rigid, every muscle as taut as a wet corded rope, the veins in his neck twisting tight as his bladder burst and he sank to the floor. It was a moment before I thought to pull his hand off my arm, peeling his fingers back carefully, afraid I might somehow hurt him. I stared down at him, dumbfounded, my tears lost in the echoes of his last words. The memory of a woman I'd never known haunted me still, even as the man I loved lay dying in my arms. It wasn't me he was thinking of as he died, was it? But a ghost. Hers was a memory I'd known all along I could never compete with, except that given time, I might have. But even that she took away from me. "Vanessa?" Livingston asked awkwardly as he sank down on his knees beside me. "Do you know who Annie is?" "Yes," I said softly, laying Richard's head on the floor and stroking the hair out of his eyes. I've always enjoyed brushing his hair out of his eyes. I loved any reason to touch him. She was his first wife, I wanted to say. Actually, I wanted to shout it, but a part of me told me to keep it locked within me. Still, I kept asking myself why he hadn't called out my name. We buried Richard in the mission cemetery on a low rise overlooking the Lepori River. It was a beautiful sight. The sun came spilling through the trees, dappling the ground with tiny teardrops of light as the wind came rustling through the leaves with a sigh, like an angel's sigh, I heard one of the children say. My mind was a million miles away as I stood on the hill, transfixed, watching the river flow in the distance, too afraid to cry, but somehow more afraid that I wouldn't. After the service, I stayed by the graveside, in spite of Reverend Hoogeveen's determined efforts to lead me back to my cabin. I shook my head, letting myself sink to the ground, forcing myself to smile as I told him I needed to see it through to the end. I sat and watched Livingston fill Richard's grave. Somehow, it felt like he was filling a deep hole in my heart. When he finished, he stood leaning on his shovel, looking down at me. "Are we done here?" he asked. I lifted my head, not realizing that I'd been staring at the ground, sifting the dry earth through my fingers. I looked at a dozen little crosses bleached bone white by the sun, some of them cracked with age, all of them weathered, and wondered how long they'd been here. How long before Richard's cross became just as weathered. "Yes," I said softly, "we're done." Livingston helped me to my feet and walked me down the path to my cabin. He stood in the open door as I sat on the edge of the bed. His figure was a dark shadow in the light of the open door. I looked up at him, speechless, and he closed the door, leaving me to my grief. The following weeks went by in something of a daze. Reverend Hoogeveen had dismissed the children from school 2 weeks earlier for Christmas, and Livingston drove each of them home in the lorry, where they sat in the back laughing, delighted at the prospect of an early Christmas. I sat in silence, wishing I was leaving with them. I spent my days grieving, coming across everyday reminders of Richard as I began packing his clothes and books, even his shaving gear. Every morning, I woke up breathing in the fading scent of his pillow. When I could stand it no longer, I told myself I had to get away from this horrible place and back to England where I belonged. That's where Gerald was, and I told myself I needed him as much as he needed me. That's when the Reverend Hoogeveen stepped in and offered to comfort me. Reverend Hoogeveen was tall and thin, an emaciated-looking man who had more in common with a lonely spectre than a man of God. He'd spent more than half of his life in Africa, he told me, burying 3 children and 2 wives in the mission cemetery. What remained of his balding hair was snow white, and there were deep lines carved along both sides of his thin lips, as well as crow's feet that looked as if they'd been scratched into the soft flesh of his face. The back of his hands were peppered with liver spots, thin blue veins of his hands standing up like tiny ridges. He wore thick black framed glasses that magnified the intensity of his blue eyes. He sat with me every night for that first week, hoping to comfort me through prayer, but his prayers left me feeling hollow inside. It felt to me as if there were a pitiable emptiness where my soul should have been. Even as I fell to my knees with him, clutching my hands until my knuckles turned white, the wedding band digging into the flesh of my fingers, serving as a somber reminder of the pain in my heart, I still couldn't make myself repeat the words he muttered or find the strength of character to believe in them. I had loved Richard with everything that was mine to give. I loved him body and soul, and yet, as he lay dying, his last words, his last thoughts, were for a different woman. It made me question Richard's love for me. Was I simply there to fill the empty space left in his heart? As much as I may have loved Everett, I'd managed to put that love behind me and start my life anew. I began to fret over the idea that Richard had still been in love with the memory of his dead wife. And when the Reverend left, I would find myself weeping into my pillow, realizing I wasn't grieving for the love I'd lost, but for a love I never had. Several weeks later, I stepped out into the stoop of my small cabin to see Livingston walking across the compound carrying a dead animal on his shoulders. I watched as the sun set behind the low rise of the cemetery, looking at the tiny white crosses in the fast-falling light as the sky slowly bled into a fiery red. The jungle stood in stark contrast against the twilight, almost as if it were a child's cutout made of heavy construction paper. I made my way up to the cemetery, and though part of me wanted to run back down the hillside, I knew it was something I had to face. I stood looking down at Richard's grave. The flowers the children had lain on it were dead now, withering along with the passing weeks. My first thoughts were that I should replace them, but then I thought of the irony of it all, how my first concern had been for Richard's cough and that he would probably die because of his asthma. It was this thinking that it was this thinking and how my concerns had all been because of his had been for naught, that had caused me to laugh. It wasn't a big laugh, more of a chuckle, something that told me I'd somehow managed to get through this on my own. I watched the shadows creeping over the graveside, with the darkness overrunning everything, as if the world were plunging into an abyss. I looked up at the evening twilight bleeding into itself, the colors streaking across the sky and the river below me gurgling like a gloomy moving shadow, and told myself there was a beauty here that I'd failed to see earlier. I turned as I heard a noise behind me. Livingston appeared with a rifle in the crook of his arm. It's not safe out here at night, he said slowly, watching the river flow in the distance. Do you think it matters to me that much? I asked after a moment. It might not matter now, and it might not matter in a week from now, but it will, he said slowly. How would you know? I asked, instantly regretting the bitterness in my voice. Because this is Congo, he said, turning to look at me. We live to die here. And oh, how prophetic those words would come to be. In May of 1960, Congo held its first election. It was an exciting time, even if most of the people didn't exactly understand what was at stake. How do you explain to a people that they've gained their independence when freedom, as we know it, is an incomprehensible concept? Livingston let himself get swept up with the events as they became known. You should have entered the race yourself, the Reverend Hugavine said calmly as he began stuffing his pipe. You're just as qualified as the next man, maybe more. Livingston laughed. How many candidates are there? I asked. If anyone believes Congo will become self-sufficient now that we've declared for independence, or self-contained as an economic power, they are sadly mistaken, Livingston replied, ignoring my question. 120 candidates, the Reverend said, turning to look at me. Why do you think that? I asked Livingston. About Congo, I mean. Don't you believe in Congo? We were sitting at the small kitchen table in the Reverend Hugavine's cabin, the soft, gentle light of more than a dozen candles filling the room. The candles splashed large, shadowy caricatures of, of us against the walls as the flames sputtered in the breeze coming through the open windows. Letitia, Livingston's mother, had been working at Belongo Station for more than 40 years. She was a large woman with a fixed expression that sometimes comes across as harsh and unfriendly. It was only when she smiled that you could see the resemblance between her and her son. And do you think the people here have any idea of what the world is like? She asked as she began clearing the table. She'd made an amazing meal of wild boar Livingston had shot earlier in the day, and when I made an effort to stand up and help her, she held a hand out until I sat down again. You don't listen to the radio like me and Livingston, do you? There's 120 different peoples out there looking to run this place, and not one of them with brains enough to want to talk to the other about what needs being done. Not true. If anyone does have a plan or wants to implement something, I began saying, then they be getting themselves arrested by government forces. What government forces? I said. There's no government. The force publique. It's the only force around here that matters. Oh, the stories I could tell you, she said, shaking her head as she left with an armload of dishes. Those are her opinions on the matter, and there's nothing you can say to change them, the Reverend said with a laugh as he finished stuffing his pipe, lighting it with slow, methodical puffs. Are you at least voting? I asked Livingston. I will be, but like Mama says, what's the use? People think that independence means we'll no longer have the Europeans here to tell us what to do. I don't see how that's possible. Someone has to run things until we educate enough of the next generation to take over. I looked at the Reverend, who was nodding in agreement. I don't see it lasting any longer than that, the Reverend smiled. If the Europeans stand to lose so much, why leave it all? I don't think we'll ever really be rid of them, Livingston smiled. We need them as much as they need us, I'm sorry to say, but by that, I mean our natural resources. But we'll always need teachers, doctors, and lawyers. We need infrastructure. But why don't you stand for office? I asked quickly. He has no wish to leave you here alone, his mother called out from the kitchen, and I looked at Livingston, who turned away in embarrassment, the soft light reflecting off his beautiful black skin. By the end of May, Livingston made it a habit to visit me at least once a week. He tried explaining what was happening, and more importantly, what it meant to Congo. I found myself smiling at everything he said. We'd sit out on the narrow veranda watching the sun set over the jungle, behind the protection of the mosquito net. I could hear the river hurtling its way into the expanding darkness, falling into the rapids and blending into the distance where I imagined it flowed through the heart of the country toward the wide expanse of the Congo River. I'd sometimes find myself looking up at the night sky, at the stars that seemed so bright and cluttered against the blackness of the night, reminding me of the boat trip upriver and my first nights on the Edgewater Fortune. It all seemed so long ago. It's so quiet here without the children, I said softly. I like it, Livingston said with a smile. Don't you like the children? Not having them here makes my life easier. I hunt once every other week, maybe once every 10 days. I don't have to make repairs because there's no one here to break things. I don't have to go into the village trading for what we need or whatever they need because we don't need anything. The Reverend enjoys his gardening, and that takes care of whatever foodstuffs we might need. I have more time for myself, and that's a luxury I don't have too often. Oh, and what do you do with all your spare time? You mean aside from following the elections, he said. Yes, politics aside, I smiled. I tend to my needs, he said softly. Your needs, I asked. Then what is it you need? What is it that Livingston Well needs that he doesn't already have? Well, he said, and then paused, looking at his feet and trying to avoid eye contact with me. Well, what? I asked, leaning forward and looking at him under the light of the hurricane lamp hanging on the post. I need a wife, he said finally, leveling a look at me. A wife, I said, and sat back. I'd never considered that he might have the same desires as other men. A wife, a family, children. I'm not a young man anymore, he explained. And how old are you? 37. What makes you think you need to find a wife? Every man needs a son. Yes, I said, sitting back and thinking now how Everett had been so pleased with Gerald's birth. Every man wants a son. And Richard, did he want sons? No, I said, shaking my head. A daughter, perhaps. How does one go about getting a wife here? I asked, changing the subject. You buy her. Buy her? Of course. I'm an excellent hunter. That makes me wealthy because I have so much to offer. You do? I mean, you are wealthy? I don't, I didn't know it mattered. I'm considered a man of standing because I know the ways of the Europeans. I live among them. And what sort of a woman are you looking for? Surely you can't be thinking of taking one from a nearby village. You need a woman who is educated. Have you ever even known a woman? I asked, somewhat boldly. What's to know about women? That's not what I asked you. He looked at me for a moment, and it seemed there was a palpable tension hanging in the air between us, heavy with this insistence, and I thought, perhaps, that I'd gone too far. I thought of Richard briefly and the last time I'd slept with the man. I wondered what I was thinking and why, oh God, why was I thinking of this with this beautiful black man? I've known women, Livingston said as he stood up. I've even known them biblically. If is that what you want? He asked, looking down at me. I'm not thinking of anything, I said, feeling my pulse quicken. What are you thinking? What you're thinking of could get a man killed. I would never. Not like that, I said, my voice a mere whisper. Did I say you were wrong for thinking it? He said, and held his hand out for me. I looked at his hand before looking into his eyes. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were daring me or offering up a challenge, and I found myself melting at the sight of him. I wanted to put my hand on his breast and feel the stirring of his heart under his dark skin. I wanted to feel his rough hands on my breast. I needed to feel the hardness of him inside of me. I took his hand, and following him into the cabin, he closed the door behind me. 4. Independence Day was June 30th, 1960. King Baudouin arrived from Belgium, delivering a speech and officially declaring Congo's formal independence. He began his speech by praising Leopold II, something that might not have been the best thing to say, and the Reverend Hugavine offered up as he sat across from me, stuffing his pipe. We were sitting around the table in the Reverend's cabin, listening to the only radio we had at Bolongo Station. Even with my poor French, I found I was able to understand almost everything the king said. A dusty ceiling fan churned the air slowly, not enough to create a breeze, but enough to stir the dust. I watched the tiny dust motes dancing in a strip of sunlight coming in through the kitchen window, my mind elsewhere. It reminded me of the moonlight coming through the window last night. I remained silent, trying to fan myself with a small pamphlet, all while watching Livingston where he sat hunched beside the radio with a look of fixed concentration. He looked so beautiful, I told myself. Oh, why, thank you, McKinley. Oh, she said that she likes it. Think. Can't quite see it. Oh, never mind. Okay. He looks so beautiful, I told myself. All at once, I pictured him in his nakedness, the moonlight glowing on his skin, the muscles of his neck straining with the intensity of his desire. I could feel his muscular arms as I reached up to meet his body, thrust for thrust, my arms holding onto the rippling muscles of his sculpted torso, hungering to feel the length of him inside of me, gasping with the pleasure, watching the whiteness of my naked flesh envelop him. I smiled at the memory and watched him as he sat hunched in front of the radio, again, picturing him holding me, holding himself above me, slipping gently inside of me, and I found myself getting hotter. I began fanning myself again. This is his day, I told myself. And does this mean the Europeans to be leaving now? Letitia asked as she busied herself cleaning the small cabin. The Reverend smiled as he held a match to his pipe, puffing slowly. I'll be staying on no matter what, he said softly, turning to look at me briefly. I can't say what I'll be doing, I said slowly, and looked at Livingston when he turned to look at me. I told the Reverend I wouldn't leave before my replacement arrived sometime in September, and he told me I couldn't think of a and told him I couldn't think of a reason for staying past then. We don't want the Europeans to leave, Livingston said, turning to look at his mother and then me. He leaned forward to adjust the volume on the radio, and I sensed his mother looking at me. Listen, this is one of the men they've elected to lead out of the darkness and into the light, Livingston said, sitting back as Kasavubu spoke. He's the country's new president, he added. He sounded like a polite man, with his positive, forward-looking attitude. The crowd was responsive and respectful, and I could see the Reverend Hugavine slowly nodding as he puffed on his pipe, the smoke wreathing about his head before the breeze from the fan snatched it away. Livington turned the radio down again and sat back, arms folded and looking serious. I wondered what he was thinking. Is that the kind of man you want leading the country? I asked him. I don't want him, his mother said before Livingston could say anything. Why not? The Reverend asked, looking up at her slowly. I don't trust him. You don't know anything about him, I said. I don't have to, she said, looking at me defiantly. I looked at Livingston. He pressed himself up to the radio again, listening to the new Prime Minister, and began waving a hand at us, motioning us to be quiet. He turned the volume up once again. If Kasavubu sounded positive, the new man, Lumumba, was furious. He accused King Baudouin of presiding over a regime of injustice, suppression, and exploitation. I was shocked by what he said, but reasoned that the man had done no more than tell the truth. As he finished his speech, I could imagine the king's embarrassment, but I was more frightened to hear the crowd roar into life. Is this the man you want? I asked Letitia. And what's wrong with the truth? She said, hands on her hips and anger in her eyes. You know nothing about what it is to live here. They cut my granddaddy's hands off because there was not enough rubber. Now, tell me, what is wrong with the truth? After the 5th day of independence, the Force Publique mutinied against all the white officer corps, and 3 days later, the gendarmerie followed. Chaos ensued. Men from both forces inflicted horrible abuses against white officers and humiliated hundreds of European civilians, especially priests and nuns. I heard some time later that Europeans were tortured and still others murdered. Scores of European women were raped, some repeatedly raped, especially the nuns. Katanga, Congo's richest province, declared its secession, taking up arms to defend its own independence. As many Europeans as could fled, boarding every available ferry from Leo and making the journey, dangerously overloaded, across Stanley Pool to Brazzaville. Others crowded into the airports. While this panicked evacuation was taking place, plane loads of Belgian paratroopers landed in an attempt to secure Leo's airport and protect Congo's European population by any means necessary. We watched them flying overhead en route to Stanleyville and Leoville in the south, big silver-hulled DC-4s that rumbled across the sky like thunder. By July 10th, most of the Europeans had fled, and those of us left behind were trapped. "We have to get out of here," Livingston said, staring up into the dark corners of the room. We were laying in bed, my legs wrapped through his. He lay with one hand behind his head, holding me pressed up against him. The night was cool, but not so cool that we had to cover ourselves. I looked at our silhouettes reflected in the dressing mirror, the light of 3 candles flickering in an evening breeze that came sifting through the open window. The river sounded like static in the background. I could see the jungle through the window, looking like a darker shadow in the shadows of the night, a full moon lighting everything outside with a dull, opaque glow. The top of the trees glistened dully, the leaves glittering like silver coins in the night breeze. "Get me out of here," I said, looking up at him briefly before settling back against him. "I'm not leaving without you," I said, making up my mind. "Me? I can't leave. This is my home. You can't expect me to leave my mother and run off with you. We'll take her with us. She'll never leave. My father's buried here, so is my brother. They're buried in the cemetery." "I didn't know that." "I didn't tell you," he replied. "It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that I'm not leaving without you. You don't have a choice. They're killing Europeans in Leo. It's only a matter of time before they start doing the same in Stan. Right now, the Belgians have secured the airports. They still have flights going out. But there's no knowing how long that will last." I will admit that I was afraid to stay, but I was just as frightened of leaving him behind. I felt safe where I was, safe with him, and I told him. He shook his head, and I looked up at him again, saw him pursing his lips in the soft light, and knew that he'd made up his mind. A part of me knew that there'd be little I could do to convince him otherwise. "It's not safe for you here," he said into the silence. "But we haven't seen anyone. They know we're here. This is Belongo Station. What about Reverend Hugavine? I can't force him to leave. Besides, he'd never leave. All the same, I'll take the lorry into the jungle and hide it. Tonight." "Why?" "As a precaution. Why can't we just drive out in the morning? There's only one road in and out. If anyone comes, the first thing they'll do is take the lorry. We can't afford to lose it. Not now. It might be slow, but it's all we have. I'd rather have it than go to Stanleyville on foot." "You want to walk back through the jungle?" "No. I know a place where I can hide it, a game trail." "When?" "Soon. Soon. But tonight." "How can you can't walk through the jungle at night," I said again. "I'll sleep in the lorry and come get you in the morning. We'll leave before it gets too hot." "Why can't I go with you? Why can't we all go?" He tried to sit up, but I wouldn't let him. I pressed my head against his chest. "I have to do this," he said, his voice soft, slow, as he tried to slip out from beneath me. He sat on the edge of the bed and turned, looking down at me. His hand rested on my leg. I put my hand on his, my fingers playing with his knuckles before interlacing between them. "You can't expect me to leave. Not without you," I said. The edge in my voice was unmistakable as I picked his hand up and brought it to my lips. "I stand a better chance of surviving here than you do. You can't make me leave. I won't let you. You can't. Not if this is the last time we're going to be together. Just the same, you can't expect me to leave Congo. Not now, not with everything going on. But I love you," I said at last. I could see tears in his eyes reflecting in the candles as he looked down at me. "But don't you see? That's why you have to leave. If you leave now, we'll have a chance at being together again. You have to live for the future." "I don't care about the future. What about tonight?" "There is no tonight," he said, reaching for his shirt sitting at the foot of the bed. He put it on, looking at me. He picked his pants up, shaking them, and stood up as he stepped into them. Looking down at me, he nodded his head. Then he bent down to blow out the candles. "Then let me come with you tonight. I don't want this night to end. You can only take what you need. You have to leave the rest. No books, no souvenirs, no memories, and very little clothing. You won't need much. Just make sure you have your passport. With any luck, you should be on a plane tomorrow." I could see his tears in the dull light of the moon coming through the window, and he heaved a huge sigh as he stood up, turning to look at me. "Tonight, we sleep in the jungle." The drive into the jungle was as frightening as I imagined it would be. There were animals frozen in fear at our approach, their eyes glowing in the lights of the lorry, their shadowy figures darting into the darker shadows of the jungle without warning. Large, frightening, nocturnal creatures I'd only ever heard of. Sorry, I'd only ever heard through the anonymity of the night. Branches whipped out of the darkness, slapping at the hood of the lorry, the fenders, and the windscreen, as if they were an angry mob and we'd been forced to run through a gauntlet of trees. Vines snared the side mirrors, long, grassy lassos hanging down like stretched tendrils of paper confetti dragging behind us, and I wondered when the road disappeared and the trail started. We came to a stop. The last thing I remembered in that short moment before Livingston turned the engine off and sank back against the seat was the dust was floating up around us. Insects hit the windscreen in the brightness of the lights. It felt as if the lorry was vibrating with the echo of its own shudder, the silence that followed speaking volumes as everything settled around us and Livingston finally turned the lights off, enveloping, enveloping us in blackness. "Do you even know where we are?" I asked, looking into the darkness. "It's a trail I sometimes use." "A trail? What kind of a trail?" "Animals use it to go to the river." "Animals? What kind of animals?" I could see his smile reflected in the darkness, the light of the moon filtering through the trees in thin slivers, and I laughed at my own unease. "Don't worry, there's nothing big enough out here to disturb your sleep," he said, as he settled down into the seat. "Sleep? You expect me to sleep after a ride like that? What would you rather do, carry on?" He put his hand on the key and I shook my head. "No, I mean, I'm too excited to sleep. I'm still vibrating from the ride. And how do you expect me to sleep in this small seat?" "The seat's big enough. You can use the stick shift to stop yourself from rolling off if you want." "Well, sorry. Yes, well, there are two of us in here," I was quick to remind him. "And I'll sleep against the shift and you sleep against the back of the seat. It's a far more comfortable position, an enviable position," he added with a laugh. And that was how we made love for the last time, locked within the close vines of the lorry, the steam of our breaths and the closeness of our bodies pressed up against each other in the darkness. I pushed myself against him, pressing, wrapping my arms around him and holding him against me in the chill of the night. I could smell the sweet, acrid scent of him, and began by touching my tongue along the soft line of his neck because I wanted to taste him. He rolled over, facing me, and I could see him in the darkness, see his shape as a darker shadow against the shadows, like the jungle pressing up against the night, as my lips sought his hungrily. His hands moved over my breast, and I moaned into him, moving against him, reaching down to feel the hardness of him pushing up against me. If I closed my eyes, I could still see his shape locked within mine. The memory of his nakedness pressed up against me as I pulled him deeper within me, thrusting myself up to meet him, kissing his thick lips, breathing in the scent of him. Those memories still visit me in my dreams, haunting me with the remembrance of a love I shall never know again. The ride into Stanleyville was quiet. I hugged my arms around my legs, watching the jungle disappear as we drove across the wide savanna. The tall jungle grass swayed in the breeze, the tiny dust behind us evaporating with the miles. There were elephants grazing and giraffes that broke off into long, lumbering gallops as we came out of the jungle, startling them. And I remembered how on the ride with Richard I'd been so excited by it all. Finally, I saw the Congo, wide, flat, immense, shimmering in the distance like a gray ribbon fluttering in the breeze, and I knew the trip would soon be over. An airplane came in low overhead, the back cargo gate opened, and I could see soldiers standing inside looking down at us, their rifles and machine guns at the ready, as if they were expecting us to shoot up at them. Livingston shifted the lorry into gear, following the trajectory of the airplane, smiling at me and saying how I was in luck. I'd probably be able to get out safely. I smiled at him, but it was a vacant smile, empty. Stanleyville was silent. The buildings shimmered coolly in the distance, and the sun reflecting off the windows, many of them broken. The river was full of fishing boats and barges, the streets quiet. If I was expecting murder and mayhem, burning buildings and overturned cars, I was in for disappointment. People were walking the streets as if nothing were wrong, the only difference being the soldiers we saw patrolling the streets. "Do you have your passport?" Livingston asked me. "Yes." "And whatever other papers you might need?" "I have them all," I said softly. "Good. I'll feel better knowing you're safe. And what about you? Do you think I'll be able to sleep at night not knowing if you're alive or dead? And Reverend Hugavine, what's going to happen to him?" "I'll get him out of here eventually. He might not think he has to leave right now, but he will in time. I'll make sure he does." "And what about you? Are you staying?" "I have to try and fix it. This is my home. I can't leave knowing I didn't at least try. Besides, even if I could, I wouldn't," he said as we approached the airport. There were thousands of soldiers milling about, machine guns at the ready as we approached. Their steel helmets reflected the sun dully. They wouldn't allow us to go any further, and as Livingston stepped out of the lorry, several of the soldiers stepped forward and pointed their guns at him. He stepped back and put his hands in the air as I stepped out and approached him. I put my arms around him, pulling his arms down, and they seemed to ease back somewhat as he followed me back to the back of the lorry, untying the small suitcase I had. "I don't want to leave you," I said. "You must." "This can only mean one thing," he said, looking at the soldiers. "Once they leave, it will be civil war. Promise me that you'll get out as soon as you can." "Yes," he said with a smile, and I knew he was lying. 3 years later, the Simbas took 1,500 European hostages in Stanleyville. The civil war Livingston had predicted seemed about to erupt. There was a joint American and Belgian rescue attempt, and while several of the hostages were killed, most of them were safely rescued. Among them, the Reverend Hugavine. I went looking for him some months later in London and asked him what had become of Livingston. "He died," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. He sounded as if I should have known about it a long time ago. "He died 3 months after you left. The force publique came to the school and beat him to death in the middle of the compound." "But why?" I asked, horrified, trying not to picture his beaten, bloody body laying lifeless in the dust. I could feel tears stinging my eyes. "He'd put his name in for political office. He was supposed to be an example," he explained. "An example? Of what? For whom?" "Why, child," he said with sincerity, "you're crying." "Yes," I said, looking down at my hands. I'd been clenching them and opened them to see my fingernails had dug into my palms. "He was an easy man to love," he said, and reaching out to me with a smile, took my hand in his. He looked at my palm and then looked me in the eye. "You knew?" I asked. "Of course I did." I left shortly after that, catching the tube out of London, watching as my reflection stared back at me. Who did I think I was convincing? I had to ask myself. I suppose I'd always known he'd die. A man like him was too passionate to remain anonymous. It was me. I was the one who had chosen to be anonymous. I'd remained in denial. I'd wanted to ask the Reverend why. The why seemed the most important question to me, but somehow I think I already knew the answer. Livingston had said it to me that night at Richard's grave. "It's Congo. People live to die here, and that's all that matters." It wasn't quite all, but it's all that I had left of him. There you go. I managed. I did it. Uh, McKinley had to leave. So sorry. Okay. That was Beyond the Pale. I hope you enjoyed it. And it wasn't that long, was it? It was only an hour and 20 minutes, which is a lot shorter than any other ones that I've ever read. I mean. And rather than trying to read it out of my notebook, so that way you'd see the top of my head like that all day, I had it on the side of the screen there, so that way I could read it, and you could, like, watch me. That's all you're doing. Oh, yeah, you're listening. Okay, so I'm going to call it a day. Let's call it Monday. I'm going to call it a day. I'm going to say adieu. I'm going to say thank you very much, dearest Kim, The Temptation 2, Josiah B. Vale, McKinley Road Creatives Had to Leave, and Steve McKinnon. Thank you kindly. And we will see you next week at the same bat time and the same bat channel. So for Stories After Dark, this is your host, Ben Woestenburg, saying adieu, and I will catch you at the same bat time and the same bat channel. So say goodnight, Dick. Good night, Dick. If you're old enough, you'll understand that, won't you, Kim? Alrighty. Ciao.